Well, I want us to turn to the Gospel of John this morning. Some of you may remember me talking about the synoptic Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those Gospels all have a lot of material that is in common. They're different for sure, but you can read through those and there's a lot that is the same. When you turn to John, which was written in Greek, from the very beginning, what is called the prologue of John, the very first verses, you can tell that this is a different kind of gospel. And certainly you can tell it as we turn to the 15th chapter this morning, the kind of redundancy you're going to find here with the use of the word abide. You can see some of that in John. But it's a wonderful, powerful passage, and I invite you to follow the reading of it on the screen. Jesus has gathered the disciples. This is part of the what's called the final discourses. And Jesus has gathered the disciples because he knows that the cross is not that far off. So these are kind of his final words of advice and encouragement to the disciples. And he says this, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear even more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me." I asked Ben to bold the word abide. You're going to see it 9 times in 9 verses. If we read the 10th verse, you'd see it 2 more times, 11 times in 10 verses. So you can probably figure out what the sermon's about today. It's about this word abide. "Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. But if you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples, as the Father has loved me." Listen to this final word. "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you." It's the promise of Jesus that Jesus will love us in the same way that God the Father has loved him. "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. For some reason, I've been thinking here lately about how insecure the world is these days. 9/11, I remember exactly where I was, as most of you, when the news of 9/11 occurred. I walked out of a breakfast meeting with a friend. My wife called me. She said, "Turn on the TV." As soon as I got to the office, I turned on the TV in time to see the 2 towers come down. Rather remarkable. It'll be the 14th anniversary this coming September the 11th. I say, how many, I don't want to ask you how old you are, but how old were you?
I was in 6th grade.
You were in the 6th grade. We have 18, 19-year-olds walking around who really have no clear memory of 9/11. And yet it has changed us forever, hasn't it? A bishop of the United Methodist Church says that we have seen the word security written and heard it spoken more times in the last few years than in all the millennia before then. We live in an insecure world. It doesn't make any difference whether you turn on the radio or the television or pick up the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. You're going to hear that word security. I think a lot of us, I know I have gotten to the point where I wish we could just make it 1 week without a mass killing in America, or without a gratuitous racial event. If we could just make it a week or 2 without a suicide bombing or a roadside bombing that kills 2 or 3 or 4 dozen people in other parts of the world. Our fear that may be coming here as well. It would really be difficult, I think, to overstate the insecurity and instability with which you and I experience today's world. It has changed since 9/11. And I won't even go into the personal things, but we know about unstable families, unstable marriages, divorce, and all those other things that make us feel insecure in this world. And so when we think about that, the word of Jesus comes to us here, and he uses this powerful, powerful word. Abide in me, and I will abide in you. That word abide, it reminds us, doesn't it, of that translation from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, the way in which he finishes the 13th chapter of Corinthians. Now faith, hope, and love abide. These three, but the greatest of these is love. Faith, hope, and love abide. In other words, these are things that will stay forever. Security on which you can count. So Jesus gathers the disciples around him, and he talks to them because he knows that their lives are about to be radically destabilized. Destabilized. He's on the way to the cross. They don't know that or understand that, but he does. He's on the way to the cross and the brutality of the crucifixion, and he is preparing them for that moment, but he wants them to know that that is not the end and that their lives can remain secure beyond that because of his love for them. And so he uses this powerful word, abide, 9 times in 9 verses. My Father is a vine grower, I am the vine, you are the branches. Abide in me, and I will abide in you. There we will be connected regardless of the circumstances of life with which we are confronted. I think it is a remarkable, and if you stop and think about it and pay some attention to this passage, it is a remarkable and powerful and perhaps life-changing understanding of our relationship with Jesus Christ. Because what you see Jesus does in this passage is he introduces us to what I call the organic nature of our relationship with Jesus. When he says, I am the vine and you are the branches, he's saying that there is no gap at all between you and me. That there's no space that you need to somehow cover or to go through in order to have a relationship with me, in order to be empowered and loved and made felt secure through my love. In the Old Testament, we get a completely different picture of God, for the most part, in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we get a picture of God that is way, way up there, and we are way, way down here, right? And there is this huge gap between us and God. And so you'll see in the Old Testament the human beings trying to develop a relationship with God by appealing to this transcendent personality. What must I do in order to get God's attention for my life? What must I do in order to get God to love me in my life? I think in some ways that concept of the relationship between God and the human is symbolized by the story of Jacob and Jacob's ladder. You remember Jacob's out there in the wilderness? He lays down, he has a dream, and he dreams about Jacob's ladder. The ladder going all the way up to heaven, angels ascending and descending, symbolic of the human desire to make connection with God. And frankly, in many ways, that Old Testament understanding of God is still the dominant one in today's America, I think. If you listen to most sermons, if you listen to most public statements or proclamations of the good news, that's what you will hear, is this understanding of God as being almost inaccessible. What must I do to get God to love me or care for me or help me to feel secure? And so this is rather remarkable, I think. Jesus gathers the disciples and he says, I will be as near to you as breath itself. Abide in me and I will abide in you. I am the vine. You are the fruit. It is the promise of Jesus to always be close by. And it is the source of our security in insecure times. The fact that God is near. It's interesting, we've talked quite a bit about spiritual discipline in recent months, and I've encouraged people to at least experiment around with what is called contemplative prayer or meditative prayer. This understanding of the relationship between Jesus and the believer is thousands of years old. It's especially prevalent in the mystic traditions of the Christian church, including some of the great saints of the church. And so for them, prayer is not so much a pleading for God to come down and help. Prayer is a matter of breathing and accepting and affirming and celebrating with joy the presence of God that is already there. The presence of God in your life. And this remarkable fact, that you don't have to inform God about the issues in your life. God already knows them. God already knows all of the issues in your life because God is intimately connected to you. And that God is already praying for you and working in your life. I encourage you to think about that way of praying. Just accepting the fact that God is with you in your prayer, working with you, loving you, and loving with you. Which brings us to the next point about this particular passage. Jesus says, I am the vine and you are the fruit. Our Heavenly Father wants you to produce fruit. I am the vine, you are the branches. Our Heavenly Father wants you to produce good fruit. Jesus says, you can't do that unless you abide in me. But if you abide in me, the work that you do will be an extension of who I am and my love for you. This is something I think is really important in the life of the church. I think there is a difference between the things that you and I do to make our community better, our world better, and the things that other people do. Because when we build a house on the corner or when we do a Project Hope, for us that is more than just doing social work. For us, that is a way of being the love of Christ in the life of the world. I've always loved that story about the little girl, 4 or 5 years old, and she had her paper out and her crayons one day, and she turned to her mommy. She said, Mommy, I'm going to draw a picture of God. And her mother said, well, honey, that's really nice, but nobody really knows what God looks like. And she said, I know, that's why I'm going to draw this picture. But that is what we do, isn't it? That is what we do when we serve in the name of Christ. We draw a picture of God for those who don't know. We draw a picture of God's love for the world, of God's love for the person who is homeless, of God's love for the person who has been battered or left alone. When we serve in the life of the world, it's really important for us to understand God is the grower of the vines. Jesus is the vine, we're the branches, and the fruit we produce is a reflection, a picture of who God is. I have to say to you, that's why sometimes I get a bit exercised, and some of you know this. I get a little worried when Christians start talking about God, especially when pastors stand in the pulpit and start talking about God in a way that looks mean-spirited, small, ugly. When preachers pick up the Bible and use it to beat people up with, that's a problem. That's a problem. Because Jesus says that we are to produce fruit which reflects God's love for the world. It's there earlier in John. You know it. You memorize it when you were young, 3:16. For God so loved the world that he sent Jesus Christ. For God so loved the world. Jesus is saying to his disciples here, when you go out into the world to serve in my name, you are drawing a picture for the world of what God's love looks like. So whatever you do, abide in my love, and I will abide in the works that you do in my name. And then finally, one more thing about this passage. This wonderful use of the word abide. God's promise to abide with us. Now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. God's love abides with us. It means that this is God's presence and God's love in our lives. They can be counted on in all circumstances. In all circumstances. It does not mean that the darkness will not come. We already know that darkness will come. If you live long enough, there will come those moments when the darkness will threaten to overwhelm your life. The promise is that God will be there, intimately connected, woven together with us in all of the challenges of life. When I was growing up, I was, perhaps not unlike a lot of children, really scared of the dark. What's a little bit different, I'm still sometimes scared of the dark. You ought to come into this sanctuary late at night or early in the morning, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning when nobody's here. It's kind of like, sometimes I can almost hear the echoes of Bart playing the organ, kind of like Phantom of the Opera. It can be a pretty scary place, pretty scary. But when I was a child, I was really afraid of the dark. And I can remember going to Paris, Tennessee, where my grandparents lived, my paternal grandparents, to visit them. And we lived in a little tiny house in Dallas, 1-story house. They lived in what I thought at the time as being a great big 2-story house. Probably wasn't that big. If I'd go back today, probably would strike me as being kind of small. But to me, it was huge. And the second story of that house, I was convinced was haunted during the night. Because we would sit out there on the front porch. These were wonderful times. My parents and my grandparents, sometimes my aunt and uncle and cousins would be there. We would sit out on the front porch. It would be on Main Street going into Paris, Tennessee. People would walk by. People were outside in those days, you know. People would walk down. The drugstores would remain open till 9 o'clock at night. My grandmother would wave at them. But there would always come that moment. We had to take a bath every night. And my father would say, "Okay, boys, time for the baths. Who's first tonight?" I had 2 brothers. There were 3 of us, so you got a 1 out of 3 chance it was going to be you. And I hated the times when I had to be the first to go up the stairs into that dark second floor. I was truly terrified. Occasionally, my father would sense how scared I was, and he'd say, "Let me go with you." And so he would take my hand, and we would walk up those stairs in the darkness. And you know, I still remember how powerful that was. When that happened, I didn't even want the light on because I felt so strong and brave and courageous in the darkness. The darkness was still there, but I was no longer afraid because of the presence, the tangible presence of my Father. That's what Jesus is saying here, isn't it? He's gathered the ones who he loves and who have followed him, and he says, the time is coming when I will not be with you. You will not be able to see me or touch me or hear me, but my Father will be with you, and the Holy Spirit will be with you. We will be present with you in another way. And so when you go through the darkness of the crucifixion and the darkness of persecution and the darkness of loss, as you will, remember that we are with you. Abide in me, and I will abide in you. Henry Light was a pastor to an English church in Devonshire, I think it was, 1847. He was suffering from tuberculosis. In fact, he was dying from tuberculosis. He planned a trip to France to recuperate, hoping that it would save his life. So he preached his last sermon to his parish church. And on the day that he preached his last sermon, he wrote the final words to a hymn that you will know. He went to France. He died in Nice 3 weeks later. But these words to this hymn remain with us. Abide with me. I'm going to ask you, Bart will I'm going to ask you to help me finish the sermon by just remaining seated, and let's sing the words to this great hymn together.